Hello, everybody. Okay, welcome to this public attitudes toward the environment session, and we've got Mike Clemence, our expert from Ipsos Trends and Foresight, here today. I apologise in advance because I'm in a very busy office, so it's a little bit noisy on my end, but I'll keep myself muted. So over to you, Mike.
Great, thanks very much, Molly, and hi everyone. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me today. As Molly said, my name is Mike. I work at Ipsos UK in the Trends and Foresight team. And over the last 10 years or so, we've done a lot of study into public attitudes in Britain, particularly, but also around the world towards climate change, the environment, and various other bits. And what I'm hoping to do in the next half hour or so is to give you sort of a lowdown on where we are at the moment. And I've sort of headed this, the climate winter, which I think is, at the end of November, perhaps an interesting title session. I think talks a little about some of the currents that we've seen at previous conferences. I've talked a bit about some of the steam going out of public attitude towards the environment. And I think we've entered an interesting phase of how people feel about the environment, where perhaps what they think is important on a day-to-day level is clashing and in tension with their values, which move a lot more slowly. So yes, as I mentioned, Ipsos, we do lots of work in this area. We observe, we ask questions, and we report back how people are feeling. So we've done plenty of different pieces of research over the past year. We regularly publish a global survey for Earth Day about attitudes towards climate change. We've worked with CAST on a net zero living, very policy-oriented document that came out earlier this year. And also, obviously, we're a very large market research firm. We do marketing, we do market research, and we think about people as consumers as well as as citizens. So we do some work in the world of sustainable packaging and what people are looking for when they purchase products, and how the environment ranks alongside other things. And so actually I wanted to start, and sorry for bringing up this picture, but about 2024 and how important it's been as a year of elections, when we were looking at the start of the year and some 4 billion people were going to have an opportunity to say, or to have a say on how they're being governed over this year. It sort of filled everyone, I think, with a mixture of dread and intrigue, in the sense that, a lot of things could have happened and indeed did come to happen, perhaps, that aren't necessarily very useful for people who are concerned about the climate. But also it speaks to how people are feeling quite strongly, because the one thing that happened across the hundreds of elections that took place this year is that any party that was in power lost votes. And it was made very clear here in Britain, for example, where there was an epoch-defining election, but also in the US and elsewhere, parties that were in power have not done well. And that's an overarching theme that is independent of the environment, and speaks a lot more to how people were feeling. And I think the things that we learned from this year, which are really important to think about before we start talking about the environment, are first that people feel that the world is really uncertain and unstable, and nostalgia. We've seen the highest level of nostalgia in Britain for 30 years in our global trend survey earlier this year. Fatalism, frustration, those sorts of feelings have come to the fore, and maybe elections are a good way to vent those feelings, but certainly there's a sense of a need for protection that stretches across the economy into the environment and further afield. As I mentioned, incumbency has become a curse. Being in power is a bad thing right now, which I suppose when you look at how the world is going, perhaps isn't necessarily a surprising conclusion to draw, but it's those factors of high prices and actually immigration, which are really driven dissatisfaction with existing governments and overridden what people think about people who are offering to come into power and the solutions that they're offering too. And that leads to this point where there's actually quite a lot of willingness to take a chance on disruptors and new forces. And in some senses that can be negative, in some senses that can be positive, but people are sort of looking for new solutions, both for long-standing problems like immigration, perhaps the environment, but also for day-to-day things as well. So sort of a sense that people get fed up with how things are going and are looking for alternatives. And throughout this, I'll ask a couple of questions. I don't think we've got the polling up, but at least I can get people to have a think. Because one thing I think is interesting is the place that climate had when it came to all of these elections that we've seen. And whether you can drop in the chat or just think to yourself, what proportion of the world sees climate change as a big concern today? Whether it's 55%, 2%, 32%, or 17%. And the result is, the answer is 17%. And when we put that in context, it shows that climate's sort of somewhere middling. And so many of the elections we've looked at, and I'll talk about Britain in a second, the UK, climate wasn't necessarily the top. And what we've seen in many countries is there's overriding concerns with inflation, with poverty, with crime, or with violence and unemployment, and actually other issues, even immigration, but also climate change ranks slightly further down. And when we think about the election in July, Britain was no exception. So we asked people in the lead up to the election, what issues are going to be the most important to help decide how you vote. And, this was a public services election in Britain. And you can see from the bar chart that the top response was healthcare. So the state of the NHS and the state of public services more broadly was really what people were thinking about when they put their pencil to paper in the voting booths, as well as being historically dissatisfied with the current government. We hadn't seen those sorts of scores before. But also there's other issues which are coming to the fore a little bit now. So asylum and immigration is an ongoing thing that gets a lot of coverage. We see in our issues index polling continuously one of the top issues alongside the economy. And that's both inflation, so people's personal economy, but also the national economy as well. So these are the sorts of issues which are ongoing and are still big issues for Britain. And you can see that protecting the environment and climate change comes out a slightly poor relation, slightly further down, alongside issues like housing and others. So, the world has been voting on lots of issues, but the environment hasn't necessarily featured as one of the biggest things that people are thinking about when they're voting. And, that's not new. I think was the other thing I say. I mentioned the issues index. It's our survey of what people in Britain see as the biggest issues facing the country. We've actually asked it in 50 years now. So we have 50 years worth of what people think are the biggest concerns. And I've taken a 10-year cut here for the proportion of people who mentioned issues around pollution, climate change, and the environment. I think what we saw maybe last decade, over the second half of the 2010s, the 20-teens, was rising concern to an extent. You can see the pandemic in early 2020 took a big chunk out of it. But actually, when we got to 2021 and the COP climate summit that was in Glasgow, 4 in 10 people said the environment was a big issue for the country. And that was not only the top issue that month, but also the highest score we've recorded on that issue since the 80s. But after that, it's been a bit of a downhill slope, or, climate change is always in the top 10 when it comes to what people are worried about, but it's rarely in the top 5. And that's what we've seen pretty much since, the day after the COP summit. And you can see from the line, there's some spikes, and that those are aligned with particularly hot periods of weather. So that other idea that, extreme weather having a bit more cut through, we certainly do see, but not in a way that maintains front of mind public concern. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that when we ask in the election, which party has the best policies on defence, on the economy, on the NHS, people will normally pick either the Conservatives or Labour. And actually, one of the things that told us the election was going to be as one-sided as it was that Labour had better attributes on all policy areas apart from defence for having the best policies. The only exception to that was the environment, where, unsurprisingly perhaps, and obviously the Greens making a breakthrough, a proper parliamentary breakthrough, is quite a significant moment in the election. It says a lot about some of the underlying dynamics that happened, but the Greens are seen as the ones who own the environment. And obviously that's useful, but at the same time, it means that perhaps expectations of both Conservative and Labour and their performance on the environment are lower than they would be if that was, like with the NHS, that's seen very strongly as a Labour issue. People become more dissatisfied when they see the Labour Party underperforming as they see it on the NHS and other public services. And so that sort of slightly being put to one side and being focused on a particular party means that it moves slightly from the centre of public mind. And of course, the elephant in the room, I suppose, is the cost of living crisis, inflation, prices, and so on. And that has dampened public enthusiasm. We've asked people how much they support different types of policies around the environmental transition, so whether that's frequent flyer levies, changing product pricing, access to sustainable pension funds, low traffic neighbourhoods. And you can see here, obviously, there's a lot of lines, but the dark blue lines are the scores in 2024, and the clear pattern for all of these policy interventions is slightly downwards. It's not changing, the overall sense of public priority or importance. Still 6 in 10 people say frequent flyer levies, they would support them. more than half say that about changing pricing to reflect environmental friendliness of products. But there has been a slight edge taken off how important people think these are. And this is before we get into the second question we ask, which is, and what if this then impinged on what you could do or cost you more personally, where you tend to drive attitudes down a little bit more. But you can see, and perhaps we'll come back to some of these very personal ones, sort of phasing out of gas boilers and electric vehicle subsidies are the ones where you've seen perhaps the most movement. And those are some of the issues which have become quite totemic in some countries, which I'll mention again shortly. So that's when we think about how people think it's important. There's also the whole point of how people act as consumers, and where environmental friendliness ranks alongside other issues when people are confronted with buying products. So, ask yourself, which of these factors is the most important when you're thinking about what to buy? Is it the quality, its environmental impact, its price, or the brand? And when we ask the public, as we did earlier this year, unsurprisingly, perhaps considering everything I've been saying, price comes out as the sort of runaway winner. And that again shows that sort of ordering that we see in the public mind. So we gave everyone a friendlier question. We let them say, well, they could say all of them are important, basically. So a bit of a cop-out maybe compared to what I asked you, but it gives you that ranking. So 95% of people say the price is important when making purchase decisions, which is unsurprising, I suppose. Quality of the product is also right up there. And then we see the other factors. So convenience, also the third most popular one, then the brand. And then we get to environmental and social impacts, which again, still important to a majority, but certainly ranking second compared with some of these other things. I think I've been in surveys a long time, and typically you're very suspicious of a percentage like 95%. But in this case, I think it's probably warranted. The price is still the top consumer consideration. That's something that's probably been given even more strength as a result of the last couple of years and how people are feeling about their personal financial circumstances in the main at the moment. And there was one other thing I wanted to look at, which is, actually fossil fuels are still quite integral to how people think the economy is going, because it's one of the things that they interact with on a really regular basis. So over the last 4 years, this is the proportion of people who've said that inflation was a concern for them. So, pre-2022, it was pretty low. It was 4 or 5%. We get this skyrocketing to sort of 50% plus as prices begin to really amp up. But when you lay that alongside the actual consumer prices index, so the level of inflation that the ONS records in the economy overall, which peaked in late 2022 at almost 10%, which is historically incredibly high, not reached since the 80s. But there's actually maybe the sort of the strength of the jump in the line is less strong and doesn't necessarily match up so well with the consumer price index overall. And that's because I think it's a measure that doesn't always get exactly at what's concerning people. When you break it down and look at food and non-alcoholic beverages, so grocery shopping, that actually inflation for that actually peaked at 20%. So underneath that 9% headline, some things are increasing more in price than others, and food, which is a very personal one, went to double the level we saw of the overall, slightly later, in fact. But again, doesn't really fit with the sort of the very sudden jump that we saw with concern about inflation. So I was looking at different types of inflation that might explain it. And actually what you see is that it's probably motor fuel that's really been the sign that drove people's concern about inflation. You can see the orange line, it leaps up in 2021. So really early on, actually, and before the invasion of Ukraine. And then that led to a public reaction, and the level of inflation that we saw, which was about 40% at one point, almost exactly at the time that we got the highest level of concern about inflation, I think also says that underneath it all, some of those norms of behavior and what people use to judge the economy, whether that's a pint of milk, 4 pints of milk, a loaf of bread, a litre of petrol, is actually also in that list. And it speaks a little bit to sort of the work that needs to be done to sort of wean people off using that as a heuristic for how the economy is doing. And I think also tells us that we need to make sure we know what people are worrying about and how people measure the success of an economy, which is one of the things that the Democrats in the US came unstuck on, was that they thought that the headline growth figure told them the economy was on the mend, but some of the issues that mattered more to people, which again were the price of food, the price of petrol, were telling a slightly different and more volatile story that made people feel like the recovery wasn't there. Obviously, contrasting environment with cost is unhelpful, and we find that in lots of questions that we ask. So half of people recently told us they would like to do more to reduce climate change and help the environment, but they can't afford to. And another half said they're too worried about the cost of living to think about the impacts of climate change and the environment. So presenting those as a binary is certainly something unhelpful when we think about messages and how you win people over to an argument. Certainly that's, maybe we're not helping. That's one way that isn't worth considering. And also the opposite doesn't work either. So only a quarter of people said they found lifestyle choices that reduce climate change and help the environment are cheaper. And that speaks to this sort of price sensitiveness and a perception that environmental options are more expensive that we find in a lot of our work with consumers. And something that, again, is sort of a reason for why perhaps people are feeling a little bit more distant from climate change as a concern right this second. Anyway, so hopefully I haven't too thoroughly depressed you too much. I think I was going to now focus a little bit on I guess what the reasons are to be cheerful around public attitudes in the environment. I used the title, climate winter a little bit, not only because I was looking out the window, but also because, obviously the year is cyclical, and the idea that, attitudes are, lower than they were and they'll never rise again is something that's important to guard against. And maybe it's thinking a little bit about how you change opinions. We'll get onto it, but climate values are very strongly embedded in the public, and then it becomes more of an implementation challenge rather than winning people over to the fact that the issue exists. And I think COP29, there's been good cops and bad cops, but actually when we look at our survey work, I think you can't really expect the world to get much more agreed than it is on this issue or any other issue, in fact. So our global trends survey this year, we ran it in 50 countries, and that includes most of Europe, many countries in Asia, a surprising number of countries in Africa. And across all those countries, we asked them, do you agree or disagree that we're headed for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly? And across all those countries, 8 in 10 people agreed. And I don't think any of the countries, there was a minority of people agreeing. It's a really clear thing that people agree with, and you can see that from the fact that there's quite so many people trudging around the world to these conferences. The world is as close as we're going to get, and the role of America is important, but other countries are important too. And this is still a moment and still an issue which unites the world in a way that very few other things do. And actually that's something I think which will be in a more important role when we think about the future. The world is becoming a more contested, tumultuous place. And actually not only is the role of these climate events is important in resolving the climate crisis, but also in providing an avenue that countries can use to talk to each other. If the world's breaking into chunks, then having at least one event where everyone can meet and talk about something that's more important than their day-to-day divisions becomes actually more important. This is a survey run by the Atlantic Council of sort of foresight experts, so people who think about the future. And they were asking, which of the following fields do you expect the greatest expansion of global cooperation over the next 10 years? And climate change is out there on its own as being the one where you get, half of people agreeing. And in a way, we're only a couple of years after the pandemic. The fact that people only 14% expect more cooperation in public health, only 14% expect more cooperation in technology governance. It's probably actually a little bit depressing, because those are some quite big issues. And nuclear non-proliferation, there 3% of the world's future experts expect that there'll be more collaboration on that point. So, that's a bit terrifying, but also it points to the fact that climate has this unique role as an issue around which everyone can gather in a way that it doesn't really work for almost anything else. If you think about all the other issues in the world that are not being resolved for lack of global resolve, it is a very unique issue, and one that can bring benefits not only to the environment, but perhaps also to wider global relations. And then one poll that we asked relatively quickly about giving legal rights to nature. I'm wondering if people can hazard a guess how many people in Britain would support giving legal rights to the natural world. You've got 12, 59, 24, or 77%. I was reasonably surprised by this. It's 6 in 10. So, I think, the archetypal example is New Zealand, where they've given legal personhood to rivers and things like that. But we do find that there's sort of a sense of caring about the environment in Britain, which I think is rising because that isn't something we used to get so much. And obviously, it's a picture of a river in England, which have got a bit of a bad press recently due to the actions of water companies. But I think it's, although the edge might have come off people's concern about climate change, I do think there's more worry about the environment, particularly the quality of water, although it's taken a lot to get here. That's a bit different about public attitudes this year. So 8 in 10 Brits support setting legally binding targets to reduce the amount of sewage being spilled in waterways that are important to wildlife and to swimmers, for example. That's, again, as close as you're going to get to consensus. So quite a strongly held view, I think, that's arisen over the last couple of years. And actually, we find that half of Britons say they're dissatisfied with the water supply and sewerage infrastructure this year. I mean, this is from a survey that we've asked for a couple of years in a row. And, until last year, people didn't really care about sewerage at all. It's just something that they didn't really think about. So it's entered public consciousness in a way that's probably quite useful from a public campaigning and public opinion perspective. And, that's decreased from satisfaction of over 3/4 in 2019. And I think, it's safe to say that the direction of travel was set. We were asking again some questions about what types of political parties people would consider voting for. And half of Britons tell us they'd be more likely to support a political party that says they will take strong action against things that cause climate change, even if that increases costs for fossil fuel companies and requires increased investment. And the opposite option that we gave, the idea that there's a party saying we will slow down actions against things that cause climate change because it's not necessary, we can't afford it right now, is 26%. And that does echo what we saw in the election. The Conservatives, in part, had a platform around, reducing the cost of net zero actions. And, it might not have been the only reason, but they were quite soundly defeated by a party that said they would continue to press forward with the targets that exist. So you're getting a sense that, people might be like, oh, well, it's a bit tricky right now, but underneath it all, it's very clear that the public are quite environmentally and climate change action minded. And that means it's sort of a reservoir of support that can be accessed dependent on messaging and campaigning and things like that. And that's really what matters. I think, taking people with you, I think, the year of elections has taught us that understanding where people are at and what's important to them and how to bring them with you is increasingly important. The snip here is from a newspaper in Germany, the German Sun Bild. I don't know if people were aware, but the German government, which was a green social democrat and liberal democrat, for want of a better word, coalition, brought in some rather aggressive targets to replace gas-powered boilers in the country, and that became an enormous issue. The Habeck's Heizhammer, the sort of the heat hammer that was going to bankrupt everybody and affect their bottom line and make people make loads of changes they didn't like, which is one of the many reasons the government's since collapsed. But the sort of the language, the way that these issues are approached is important. We saw earlier on that although it's decreasing, there's still quite a lot of support for phasing out gas boilers in Britain. But it's one of those sort of totemic issues that people get very sensitive about. Low traffic neighborhoods being another one that generates perhaps a lot more discussion than it should. And so that when you take people with you, when you're thinking about campaigning, then language really matters, and what you aim for really matters. Otherwise, you end up with these sort of enormous scandals that blow up over seemingly nothing. And choice matters too, and giving people a feeling of control, which is obviously a very important word in previous elections here in Britain. So we asked people about whether they supported a policy of increasing vegetarian and vegan options available in public food settings. And roughly half of people said, yeah, I'd support that. And then if it meant you had a larger range of vegetarian and vegan options to choose from, the level of support remains the same. So people are sort of, the idea that there's more choice is something that doesn't affect how people view this policy. But then if we said, if it meant you couldn't have as many meat and dairy options as you used to, people then feel that sense of loss and the level of support then dips. And the numbers aren't necessarily too great, but I think it's exactly that sort of change in language that becomes so important when an issue like climate moves from being something that we need to get everyone to realize is happening to something that requires detailed policy work to enact. And it's those sorts of points where I think, you can see that there's different ways you can approach it. And those will have very different outcomes on a public that's struggling to maintain the sort of priority on climate change in the face of so many other things that are going on. And it is, it is just like an election. I think that sort of idea that there's different groups of people who might be receptive to different types of messages. So this is our global climate segmentation. Basically, we asked a lot of attitudes around people who, thinking about how they feel about the environment, the extent to which they're willing to make change, and various other things. And the world sort of falls out into these 5 chunks. So you have the idea of activists, obviously perhaps many people on this call, those who are like, it's up to me to make change happen, to wake up the world, and actually a fifth of Britons fall into that category. Then, along the line of keenness, you get the idea of sort of willing contributors. So people who are happy to help, but maybe a little bit more pragmatic and aren't necessarily going to be as activist as that activist group, but definitely on board and open to taking steps, perhaps not all the steps. There's that sort of middle group, the discerning realists, maybe the busy families, who they're focused on, things that work. They don't want to experiment with something that may or may not help. They really just need to be told that there are these steps you can take that will fit into your busy lifestyle, will help the environment. And that's, roughly 15% of the population too. Actually, in Britain, and we have quite a few more of this group than many other countries, looking at the people who are going to be doing enough to keep people off their back. So I'll be doing enough not to be called out, the passive compliers. So they'll do what they're told if there's a feeling that if they don't, someone will notice. And that's quite a big group. That's 3 in 10 of the public. I think it's about a fifth of our sort of 15 country sample. So Britain over indexes on people who will do what it takes to not be called out. And then, of course, you have the same size as the group of activists, a group of disengaged people who are like, it's not my job to save the world. And there are things you can do, but I think it's when you get to this point, you're like, well, who's most important to affect change in, and what types of messages are going to work? You begin to think about, how do you talk to different types of people? What messages might support the activists to keep doing what they're doing? How are you going to make things appear easier to the willing contributors or the discerning realists? And how are you going to instill a healthy sense of fear into passive compliers, so that they feel that they'll be raising the floor and there are things that they should be doing in order to keep things ticking along? And I think that's sort of the point that you're at almost. It's about digging into little groups and understanding different areas rather than thinking about people in the broadest sense of the word, because the message is about what steps need to be taken and how you make bigger steps rather than talking about whether or not it's important. And then the other thing, and this is obviously quite a complicated chart, so I'll talk it over, but thinking about information mismatches and where people are getting their information from, which is another element of any sort of campaign. So we asked people, which of the following groups do you get information about policies to help the UK meet its net zero targets from? And then who do you trust to provide reliable information about that? And it opens this divergence here where, towards the right-hand side, you have the groups that are more used than they are trusted. So TV, news and radio, print media, and then a whole host of, celebrities, public figures, national politicians, local councils, people on social media, my friends, my family, my colleagues. Those are the ones who are being more used, but are also perhaps less trusted. And then on the other side, particularly scientists and academics, but to a lesser extent, climate change charities and international organizations, you have the groups who are seen to perhaps be more trusted, but less easy to get hold of, or less easy to access information from compared to everyone else. So there's a tension in the information environment, perhaps, that the sources people hear about from the most aren't the ones that they trust to provide them with the right information, or trust them less, I would say. It's still a reasonable level of trust. And that's good news in some ways, because we've just finished our Veracity Index, which is our annual poll of which professions Britons find the most trustworthy. And actually, we do see rising trust in some of those groups on the other side who might be trusted to deliver a message around climate change. So the obvious one is professors and scientists. We've got 85% of the British public say they trust professors to tell the truth. So the government chief scientist, Dame Angela McLean, and that's up 9 points on last year. Scientists too, however people imagine them. I tried to find a photo of one not in a white lab coat, but it's surprisingly difficult on publicly available stock image sites. At least he's outside and not in a lab. 8 in 10 trust them to tell the truth too, and that's also an increase. And scientists are actually one of the biggest professions where we've seen an increase in trust over the 40-year life of the survey that we've been running. And even government ministers, Steve Reed here, they've seen a small increase in trust, to tell the truth. Not revolutionary, not earth-shattering. It's still only 15% of people trust them, but it is up 5 points from last year. Although politicians generally remain bottom of the list, trusted by 1 in 10, and that hasn't changed as a result of the election. So there's the idea that, you know, the people who might be important messengers, we were seeing an increase in trust, and actually we're also seeing an increase in trust in people generally. So that idea of social trust, that you trust people in your local neighborhood, in the country more generally, to do the right thing, to return your wallets, whatever it might be, that's increased. And that's a really good sign, actually, a sign of a society where trust is increasing. And that's quite useful, I think, particularly for something like climate change, where everyone needs to pitch in, and we're relying on other people to do their bit. That's pretty much everything. I'll finish now with a couple of conclusions, then open the floor as far as I can to some questions. The one, yes, the idea of a climate winter. We're in a really turbulent time. No one needs me to say that. It's really obvious. And that's testing the resolve and the attention of the public, but also politicians and businesses. There's a lot going on, and it can be difficult to stay the course on something like climate, particularly as the steps required get more difficult and more challenging. But underneath it all, I do think are the values that we see. So the idea that you've got deep set views about how the world should be. I think the British public remain quite environmental in their values, and those values take longer to shift. So obviously there's a lot going on, but your values take longer to move. And so the public remain well, with a good view of environmental and climate change action. And actually that point that controlling climate change is a domain of global cooperation that's really quite unique and will probably be helpful in the years to come as things get probably a bit more turbulent still. And then that final point, the idea of implementing climate action is just different. Maintaining public support and pressure requires a campaigning mindset. Maybe we can learn from the year of 4 billion people voting that there's new messages, new campaigning, new voices that need to be activated to keep the pressure up and to get people to get through this climate winter and maybe become a bit more open-minded to making the changes that are needed to meet all the various targets we've committed to. And I think that was one final chart. I'll shut up after this one. But we have asked people whether we're headed for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly for a long time now. And for a long time, we thought the earliest we'd asked it was in 2013. And that's sort of, if you cover up half the page with your hand, that tells a story of sort of a very simple increase in concern. But we were digging through our archive and we found another 10 years worth of data. And actually then that makes it look a bit more like sort of a pair of camel humps or something. There's been a sort of a jumping up and down. And I think that's part of the message, right? What comes up can come down and then it can come up again in the face of different stimuli and different things that are happening. Like the last dip was after the global financial crash. We saw a bit of a dip last year because of cost of living pressures. I think it's, the direction is high and it's still reasonably up or level. But we just need to remind ourselves that because something goes down doesn't mean it won't go up again afterwards. And that's probably how I'd describe British public attitudes towards the environment this year. With that, I'll stop and thank you all for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mike. That's super interesting. And it gives me a little bit of hope about the state of our country right now.
That was the aim.
Yeah, that's good. So we've got a few questions for you. Firstly, we've just got a little bit of an admin one. Kat's asking if you mind sharing those slides with everybody, if that's possible.
Happy to share the slides. Sure.
Fabulous. We will send them around then. Great. And then we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A section. So we've got, so this is Alex that's asking this. How has the climate change survey data changed over time? Are the figures on the graph representative of long term, or has something changed this year? I'm not sure which graph this was referring to, but
it's a shame. But anyway, that's certainly the point, the thrust of the, things have been changing and they've been up and they've been down. And you can reasonably assure that they'll be up again. Like we've the fact that the climate crisis, it's relatively new. So actually what's happened is you don't ask the questions you wish you'd asked 20 years ago. because it wasn't the same issue at the time. But we're beginning to build 10+ year trends. And I think, you can see over the long term that certainly Brits are becoming more climate oriented in their values, even if they're finding it tricky because of events.
Right. Okay. We've got another question. Oh, sorry. Alex did say this was then followed on up with the answer. Maya has asked, she says she missed the beginning and she doesn't know much about this kind of polling. So this may have been answered, but she's wondering if you can go into more detail on who you ask, how many people, and the methods used to reach them.
Certainly. We do a mix at Ipsos. Online polling is primarily what we do. So you have panels, you can access other panels, much like YouGov or someone else. You can have a representative sample, and the aim is always representativity. So you aim to get a sample of people that match the British population on age, on gender, on region, and create a sample that looks like the population you're trying to sample. We also do telephone polling as well. So we've got a couple of different methods in there. So the issues index was face-to-face, moved to telephone over the pandemic. And then again, I guess you're randomly dialing all numbers in the country or a section of them, and that gives you a sort of a random sample. But the two methods that we use, and that's very similar to the rest of our other colleagues in the industry, is online and telephone polling. And every time the idea is you get a representative sample. So you've got people of all ages, all backgrounds, all parts of the country answering.
Great, thank you. Graham's also asked, a few decades or so ago, the hole in the ozone layer, so to speak, was a key issue, and the public faced the issue of banning CFCs from fridges, freezers, and aerosols. This proved effective and reasonably straightforward. Is there any research linked to this, and can these actions be replicated?
No, and when I was looking at the long-term charts, I was wondering whether the previous peak was something to do with the tail end of the ozone layer question, because certainly that was a huge issue. It's slightly different in some senses, but also very similar in the sense that it's planetary. It requires international cooperation. I suppose the answer was comparatively simple. It's removing a particular category of chemicals from fridges rather than all internal combustion engines from all cars and everything else. But methane's a good example, that there's a lot more collaboration on the removal of methane, which is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas, and again something that people know comes from cows and natural gas stands. So I think you do see movement in those areas where it's easier to fix. But yes, this is a bit bigger than the hole in the ozone layer, and unfortunately I think it's going to take a bit longer to fix.
Yeah, quite fair enough. We've got a few more questions. We've only got time for a couple more, I think. So Lorna's asked, given the data here, what campaign messages do you think would be most effective to mobilize the public to act for nature? Very interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll probably not quite answer it. I think there's no one message. That's probably what we've found. That's always the case, but I do think now, particularly when the impact of inflation and costs and those sorts of things are quite sectoral and affect people very differently. Sorry, the priorities that people have will be quite different. So there's probably there's an extent to which how you say that it's easy, or you say that it's cheaper, or you say whatever. There's no one solution. I think definitely now. A couple of years ago, maybe it was a bit easier to tell everyone that they need to save the planet and they need to do this and that. But I think it's, particularly with everything else that's going on, and it feels like there's more going on than there was, it becomes more complicated to find messages that unite a lot of people, and there's more required to find more messages that target individuals or small groups.
Thank you. We've got two more questions, so I reckon we can fit them in. So the first one is from Azim, who asks, how many people refuse to do your surveys? And most people, they say that most people they meet don't trust experts and are far more disengaged from the climate crisis than your numbers seem to say. And somebody else has also commented on this, saying they'd like to know how that affects your survey results and how you take that into account.
Absolutely. I think there are different methods, and obviously not everyone's going to take part, and you can't, it's like an election again, like not everyone's going to vote, and we don't, maybe we should, but we don't take into account or try to assume the views of people who don't want to take part in an election in the same way you wouldn't in a survey. I think it's because it's impossible to know, and you don't want to make assumptions about people's views. I think obviously with refusal rates, they are different and different methods. I think we did the exit poll earlier this year, so the official general election exit poll, and 85% of people agreed to take part, and that's a high point. It comes much lower when you get to online. Often with panels, it's not even a question that you can answer. And whenever you talk about the public, you're going to be missing out some people. So we try to give a broad view, and we do weight the data. So the idea is that you set out to achieve a sample that's half men, half women, has 10% of people from Scotland and however many from London and so on, and you don't always hit it. And what you can then do is you can over and under weight the views of people from particular areas to make the sample look more representative and make it reflect better what would have happened if everyone had taken part. Obviously, there's errors, there's margins of error on everything that we do, but hopefully it's at least reasonably helpful to get an understanding of broadly where the public are, even if I have to say it's plus or minus 3% or 5% when you get to an individual figure.
Yeah, great. I think that really helps to understand how the data work. So final question, I think, and then we'll have to call it there. Does age matter? Are young people more concerned about climate, and is this increasing, or is there no real difference between ages?
It's a great question. Probably should have asked it earlier. So I think we get to the point now, and that's my point about values, is that when you ask Britons if the environment is important, 4 in 5 people say yes, and that's regardless of age. And in a way, it's a little bit frustrating when you're doing surveys that everyone just kind of says yes, and it doesn't really help you. What we do find is that I think when we ask people whether they feel guilty about their impact on the environment, that tends to be higher amongst younger people. But that as well is different to action. And obviously surveys are measures of stated intentions rather than what people are actually doing. And there's probably some evidence that older people might be slightly better at doing what they say they will than younger people. So it's a bit of a mixed picture in the sense that, younger people might feel guilty and might be slightly more motivated to do things, but maybe slightly less likely to actually do them. So I think maybe they're level in that sense, in that one says more and one does more, but they both say they care. So it's a bit mixed, I would say. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting question, because the assumption is always that young people will love the environment and old people will hate it, but that's not supported by any of the data that we have, and that anyone else has for that matter.
Sorry, I realised I was muted. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
I think we'll have to call it there for today, but yes, and we'll share your slides with everybody in the audience, and thank you for coming to this session.
Have a great rest of the conference. Bye, everyone.